April 1241. The heart of Europe trembled as a new and terrifying force swept across its eastern frontiers. For centuries, the kingdoms and duchies of Christendom had believed themselves protected by faith, tradition, and the steel-clad might of their knights. But now, on the rolling fields of Silesia, that confidence was about to be shattered by an enemy unlike any they had ever faced: the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, forged by the legendary Genghis Khan, was the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. In less than 2 generations, it had exploded out of the steppes of Mongolia, swallowing kingdoms and cities from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Europe. The Mongols were not the mindless barbarians that frightened European chroniclers would later describe. They were a disciplined, highly organized military machine, built on a foundation of speed, adaptability, and ruthless efficiency. Every Mongol warrior was born in the saddle, learning to ride before he could walk, and to shoot a bow before he could speak. Their composite bows, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, could send arrows flying with deadly accuracy at distances that left European archers in awe. Mongol horses, small but incredibly tough, could cover vast distances at a pace that left their enemies breathless. The Mongols could survive for weeks on little more than dried meat and fermented mare's milk, allowing them to move quickly and strike where least expected. By 1241, the Mongol Empire was a juggernaut. The great cities of Central Asia had fallen, the proudest powers of the Islamic world had been humbled, and even the Great Wall of China had failed to hold them back. Now, under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, the Mongols had already annihilated Kiev, the jewel of the Rus, and swept through Hungary like wildfire. Their invasion was not a random act of plunder, but a meticulously planned campaign. Batu divided his forces with surgical precision. One army ravaged Hungary, while another surged into Poland, determined to eliminate every possible threat to their flanks. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed. Lublin was torched, Sandomierz looted, and Krakow left a smoldering ruin. Their next target was Silesia, one of Poland's richest and proudest duchies. The news of the Mongol advance spread like wildfire, carried by terrified refugees and grim-faced messengers. The stories they told were almost unbelievable. Entire cities reduced to ash in a single day, populations slaughtered to the last soul, veteran armies erased in hours. Survivors spoke of demons on horseback, warriors who appeared from nowhere and vanished like ghosts. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious for his deep faith, understood the gravity of the threat. He was no naive noble. He had seen the reports from the east, and he knew that if the Mongols were not stopped here, the heart of Europe itself would be left exposed. Henry refused to run. Instead, he sent out desperate pleas for help across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was nothing short of extraordinary. The legendary Knights Templar, veterans of the Crusades, answered his call. The Teutonic Knights rode down from the Baltic, their heavy cavalry armored in black and white. Polish nobles set aside their rivalries and rallied their men. Duke Mieszko of Opole brought his full host. Moravian infantry marched north. Even miners from Silesia, men who had never seen battle, took up arms to defend their homeland and their faith. Chroniclers, awestruck by the gathering host, claimed that 100,000 men had assembled to resist the Mongols. Modern historians, comparing logistics and population records, suggest a more realistic number of 25,000 to 40,000, still one of the largest European armies of the medieval age. For comparison, William the Conqueror had taken England with barely 10,000 men, and the mightiest Crusader armies rarely topped 30,000. Opposing them stood around 20,000 Mongols, 2 Tums under Baidar and Khatun. The Europeans outnumbered them, wore heavier armor, wielded superior steel, and marched under the Pope's blessing. They believed God was with them. They would soon learn that faith alone would not be enough. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and Khatun, son of Ogidi, were not mere warlords, but masters of strategy, men trained from birth in the science of war. The Mongols had spent years studying European warfare through spies disguised as traitors. They knew every strength and every weakness of their foes. The European knight was the tank of his time, a man, a horse, and a mountain of steel, capable of smashing infantry lines apart. But the Mongols understood their flaws. Knights were slow, their mounts quickly exhausted, and their hunger for glory made them reckless. Most crucially, they fought best in close combat, while Mongol warfare was about killing the enemy before he could even reach you. April 7, 1241. The European army advanced from Legnica in traditional formation, a vision to stir any medieval heart. In the center rode the heavy cavalry, knights clad in chain and early plate armor, helmets gleaming in the sun, lances raised high. Each suit of armor cost what an entire village might earn in a year. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for power, snorted and pawed at the earth, eager to charge. On the flanks marched Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and Silesian miners wielding crude tools turned into weapons. Priests walked among them, offering blessings and absolution. Banners rippled across the field, the black cross of the Teutonic Order, the red of the Templars, the white eagle of Poland. It was the combined strength of Christian Europe made flesh. Then on the horizon a strange dust cloud appeared, not the heavy dust of a marching host, but a lighter, restless haze that moved with unnatural speed. The first Mongol scouts appeared, small figures on small, wiry horses. The knights laughed. These were the dreaded Mongols? Tiny men on half-sized mounts? Surely they could be crushed in a single charge. But the Mongols did not come close. They stopped just within their bow range, far beyond that of the Europeans. The Mongol composite bow, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, could strike targets with lethal accuracy at over 350 meters, far beyond the reach of any European crossbow. Their riders loosed their arrows high into the sky, then wheeled their horses and sped away. "Cowards!" shouted the Polish knights. "They flee like rabbits, like women." But fleeing was the plan. It wasn't fear, it was doctrine. For hours, waves of Mongol horse archers tormented the European lines. They would gallop in, unleash volleys of arrows, and retreat before the heavy cavalry could respond. Each warrior carried roughly 60 arrows, with pack horses trailing behind, loaded with hundreds more. 20,000 men, 60 arrows each, over 1,000,000 projectiles. The mathematics of death. The Europeans raised shields and endured, but mentally, it was breaking them. These knights had trained their whole lives for gallant charges and sword-to-sword glory, not to stand helpless as invisible enemies bled them dry from afar. Horses screamed as shafts found the gaps in their armor. Men cursed as arrows pierced mail at the joints. The unarmored infantry suffered the worst. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to return fire, but by the time they cranked and aimed, the Mongols had already slipped back out of range. The Templars begged permission to charge, but Henry refused. He knew too well that this was exactly what the Mongols wanted. As the sun set on that first day, the fields of Silesia were littered with the dead and dying. The proud armies of Europe had met the Mongols, and the old ways of war would never be the same. Night fell over the bloodied fields of Silesia, but neither side rested easily. The Mongols, ever disciplined, rotated their horses, tended to their wounded, and prepared for the next day's maneuvers. In the European camp, the mood was tense and uncertain. The knights, so used to the certainty of a charge and the clarity of close combat, found themselves shaken by an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. The air was thick with the groans of the wounded and the whispered prayers of men who had never before doubted their own invincibility. Duke Henry II, his armor dented and his spirit tested, gathered his commanders. The Templars, proud and eager for glory, pressed him to allow a full cavalry charge at dawn. The Teutonic Knights, more cautious, warned that the Mongols were not to be underestimated. The Polish nobles argued among themselves, some calling for a retreat to fortified positions, others demanding an immediate attack. Henry listened, weighing each voice, but in his heart he knew that the Mongols had not yet revealed their true strength. As dawn broke on April 8, the Mongols resumed their harassment. Once again their horse archers darted in and out, loosing arrows with uncanny precision, then melting away before the Europeans could respond. The European infantry, battered and demoralized, began to falter. Some men broke ranks, seeking shelter behind the knights or fleeing toward the rear. The discipline that had held the army together began to fray. But the Mongols were not content to simply wear down their enemy. They were masters of psychological warfare, and now they set their most cunning plan into motion. Bata Khan and his generals had studied the European way of war. They knew that the knights, for all their discipline, were driven by pride and a thirst for glory. They also knew that the European command structure was rigid, and that once the knights charged, it would be nearly impossible to recall them. The Mongols began a feigned retreat, a tactic perfected over decades of conquest. Their horse archers fell back in apparent disorder, leaving behind a trail of wounded and abandoned equipment. To the Europeans, it looked like the Mongols were finally breaking. The Templars, unable to restrain themselves any longer, begged Duke Henry for permission to charge. This time, with his lines crumbling and his men's morale at the breaking point, Henry relented. With a thunder of hooves and a clash of steel, the European heavy cavalry surged forward. The knights, resplendent in their armor, lowered their lances and spurred their massive destriers into a full gallop. The ground shook as hundreds of horses pounded across the field, banners streaming, voices raised in a battle cry that echoed across the plain. For a moment, it seemed as if the old ways might prevail after all. But the Mongols had set their trap perfectly. As the knights advanced, the Mongol horse archers wheeled around and unleashed a withering hail of arrows. The knights, their horses already exhausted from the charge, found themselves under fire from all sides. The Mongols, riding in loose formation, could shoot in any direction, even backwards as they retreated. The European cavalry, packed tightly together, became easy targets. Still, the knights pressed on, determined to reach the Mongol lines. Some managed to break through, cutting down a handful of Mongol warriors. But the Mongols simply gave ground, drawing the knights further and further away from their own infantry and support. The European formation began to unravel. Isolated and surrounded, the knights found themselves fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, the Mongols executed another of their signature tactics, the taluma, or enveloping maneuver. Hidden units of Mongol cavalry who had been waiting on the flanks, now swept in behind the charging knights, cutting off their retreat. The European infantry, seeing their cavalry disappear into the distance, began to panic. Some tried to follow, only to be cut down by Mongol archers. Others attempted to form defensive circles, but the Mongols simply rode around them, picking them off one by one. Duke Henry, realizing the disaster unfolding before him, tried desperately to rally his men. He rode from group to group, calling for order, urging his commanders to regroup. But the chaos was too great. The Mongols, sensing victory, pressed their attack. Their arrows fell like rain, and their lances struck with deadly precision. The European army, once so proud and confident, was now a shattered mass of fleeing men and dying horses. In the midst of the carnage, the Templars and Teutonic Knights fought with desperate bravery. Surrounded and outnumbered, they formed tight circles, their banners held high, determined to sell their lives dearly. But the Mongols were relentless. They circled the defenders, loosing arrows until the ground was carpeted with the dead. The miners and peasants, untrained and poorly armed, stood little chance. Many threw down their weapons and tried to flee, only to be cut down by Mongol cavalry. Duke Henry himself fought with the courage of legend. Surrounded by his household knights, he made a final stand near a small chapel. The Mongols, recognizing his banner, concentrated their attack. One by one, Henry's defenders fell. At last, the Duke himself was struck down, his body pierced by Mongol arrows. According to some accounts, the Mongols beheaded him and displayed his head on a spear as a warning to others. By the end of the day, the field of Legnica was a scene of utter devastation. The flower of European chivalry lay dead or dying. The banners of the Templars and Teutonic Knights were trampled in the mud. The Mongols, victorious but disciplined, did not pause to celebrate. They gathered their wounded, counted their dead, and prepared to move on. For them, this was just another battle in a long campaign. The news of the defeat spread quickly. Survivors staggered back to their homes, bringing tales of horror and defeat. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered. The Mongols had shown that even the mightiest armies of Christendom could be broken by cunning, discipline, and superior tactics. But for the Mongols, the campaign was far from over. Their eyes now turned to the west, where new targets awaited. The fate of Europe hung in the balance, and the world would never be the same. The fields around Legnica were silent now, save for the crows and wolves that came to scavenge among the fallen. The Mongols, ever efficient, did not linger to gloat over their victory. They stripped the dead of anything useful, armor, weapons, horses, and moved on with the same relentless discipline that had brought them to the heart of Europe. For the survivors of the Christian coalition, the defeat was more than a military disaster. It was a spiritual and psychological blow that would echo for generations. Word of the catastrophe spread with terrifying speed. Messengers and broken survivors carried the news to every corner of Poland, Bohemia, and the German states. In the towns and villages, people wept for lost sons, fathers, and brothers. Churches filled with mourners and priests struggled to find words of comfort. The myth of European invincibility, so long a source of pride, had been shattered in a single brutal campaign. The Mongols, meanwhile, pressed their advantage. Their victory at Legnica was only one part of a larger, coordinated offensive. Even as the dust settled in Silesia, another Mongol army under Subutai and Batyr Khan was rampaging through Hungary, crushing King Bela Ivy's forces at the Battle of Mohi. The twin disasters at Legnica and Mohi left Central Europe defenseless, its armies broken and its people paralyzed by fear. Yet, for all their power, the Mongols did not press on to conquer the rest of Europe. Historians have long debated why. Some point to the sudden death of the great Khan Ogdi in distant Mongolia, which forced Batu and his generals to halt their campaign and return east to participate in the succession. Others suggest that the Mongols, having achieved their strategic objectives, eliminating potential threats on their flanks and demonstrating their overwhelming superiority, saw no need to risk further losses in the heavily fortified cities of Germany and Austria. Whatever the reason, the Mongol withdrawal was as sudden as their arrival. To the battered kingdoms of Europe, it felt like a miracle. Chroniclers described it as divine intervention, a sign that God had spared Christendom at the last moment. But the scars of the invasion remained. Entire regions had been depopulated, their towns and villages burned to the ground. The flower of European chivalry had been cut down in its prime. The survivors, haunted by memories of fire and blood, would never forget the terror of the Mongol horsemen. The legacy of the Mongol invasion was profound and far-reaching. In the immediate aftermath, European rulers scrambled to reform their armies and fortifications. The old reliance on heavy cavalry and static defenses was called into question. New tactics were developed, and greater emphasis was placed on mobility, intelligence, and coordination. The Mongols had shown that even the most formidable knights could be outmaneuvered and destroyed by a disciplined, flexible enemy. Diplomatically, the shock of the Mongol victories led to a flurry of activity. Kings and princes sent embassies to the Mongol court, seeking to understand this new power and, if possible, to secure peace. Some even dreamed of forging alliances with the Mongols against their Muslim rivals in the Holy Land, though such hopes would ultimately come to nothing. The Mongols, for their part, remained enigmatic and unpredictable, their ambitions stretching from the heart of China to the plains of Hungary. Culturally, the invasion left a deep mark on the European imagination. Chroniclers and poets struggled to make sense of what had happened. Some described the Mongols as a scourge sent by God to punish the sins of Christendom. Others saw them as the heralds of the apocalypse, the horsemen of revelation come to bring about the end of days. The image of the Mongol warrior, swift, merciless, and seemingly invincible, became a symbol of terror that would haunt Europe for centuries. Yet, in time, the shock of the Mongol invasion also brought about a new sense of unity and purpose. The kingdoms of Europe, long divided by rivalry and suspicion, began to recognize the need for cooperation in the face of external threats. The memory of Legnica and Mohi became a rallying cry, a reminder that the survival of Christendom depended on more than just faith and tradition. It required adaptation, innovation, and solidarity. For the Mongols, the campaign in Europe was just one chapter in a much larger story. Their empire would continue to expand and evolve, shaping the course of history across Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. The lessons they taught, about mobility, intelligence, and the ruthless application of force, would be studied and emulated by generals for generations to come. But for the people of Poland, Hungary, and the lands beyond, the spring of 1241 would never be forgotten. The fields of Legnica, once green and peaceful, had become a graveyard for the hopes and dreams of a generation. The Mongols had come and gone, but the memory of their passing would linger like a wound that refused to heal. In the years that followed, Europe would rebuild. New leaders would rise, new armies would be trained, and new fortresses would be built. The Mongol threat would recede, but the lessons of Legnica would endure. The world had changed and the old certainties were gone forever. The Battle of Legnica stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the unpredictability of history. It is a story of courage and tragedy, of innovation and adaptation, of the clash between worlds that shaped the destiny of a continent. In the end, it was not just a battle between armies, but a confrontation between two visions of war, two ways of life, and two destinies. As the centuries passed, the memory of Legnica faded, but its lessons remained. The Mongols had shown that no civilization, no matter how proud or powerful, was immune to the tides of change. In their wake, they left a Europe that was wiser, more cautious, and, perhaps, better prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. And so, the story of the Mongol invasion of Europe is not just a tale of conquest and destruction. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human spirit. The fields of Legnica may be silent now, but their echoes still remind us of the day when the world changed forever.